so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
When we initially talked to Mike, I called his home, and he wasn't at home, and his son answered the phone. And I said to his son, I need to talk to your father to see whether or not he'll come to the Swickley Men's Club and be a speaker. And I don't know if you recall, we set a new record this past winter for record cold. It was 12 degrees below zero. And this kid's telling me his dad's on a camping trip. And I was baffled. I almost dropped the phone. I said, who in the hell would go camping at 12 degrees below zero? Little did I know, Mike was camping in 55 below zero weather in the Antarctica. He's an interesting guy. He was in the service. He was an Army Ranger, a paratrooper, and then went into teaching, and he teaches gifted children. Who's responsible for batteries, Pat? He said, no, it went back on. And you're turning it on. Forward button. Everybody said the electronically yours. But anyway, Mike did a trip to the Antarctica placing new weather vanes, and he's going to tell you the whole story, I think, at the end. So give him a warm welcome, please.
All right, good morning. I won't hit the mute button. Hi, my name is Michael Penn. I am a school teacher, so you are not my typical audience. I teach 4th, 5th, and 6th graders. I have been all over the country speaking about this. I was in Antarctica so that I could expose kids to great science. I'll try to get into that in a minute. But I left several days after Christmas, and I arrived back several days before New Year's Day. So I was gone for 5.5 weeks about. My mother-in-law is sitting right there, so I can't make any of this stuff up. She knows a good bit about this. So I went with the United States Antarctic Program and was all paid for by the National Science Foundation. I have a video that I'm going to play, but I'm going to stop it about 1,000 times and explain what we're looking at. This video was really geared for kids, so bear with me if some of it seems juvenile, but it's still very interesting. I spoke to one of the gentlemen here who said his wife has been to Antarctica as a tourist. Another gentleman asked if I had seen or what ship I was on. Was not on a ship at all. I was on the continent the entire time, so never saw open water. And I'll answer some basic, frequently asked questions right now. The temperature never got above 20 below, and it's summertime. So our winter, of course, is the Antarctic summer. It was daylight 24 hours a day. And I was there at the summer solstice, So at that point, the sun was at its highest elevation, 23.5 degrees above the horizon, and it just circles around the horizon. And I did get an email from a flat earther, and I apologize if any of you are flat earthers, but who challenged me to prove that I was actually at the South Pole, and I did a little trigonometry in response to explain that, yes, I actually was, and I ended up putting a pole in the ground and measuring the shadow of the pole and then doing the inverse tangent of that angle to get 23.5 degrees, proving that it actually was the solstice at the South Pole. So there you go. All right, so the National Science Foundation paid a lot of money for me to do this, a whole lot of money for me to do this. And the reason is Mars. Seems strange, but when we go to Mars, the astronauts that go are probably in 4th, 5th, or 6th grade right now. So, and we are by far the world's leader in science. Almost all science on the planet is paid for by the United States, and it all comes through the National Science Foundation. Even if it's conducted by other countries, we generally pay for it. And we want to stay there, and so we need kids to be excited about science. So, this is just going to run along here. And so Antarctica, this is the program I went through, and it's a program for teachers because we have access to kids. So this is the team I went with. There were 5 of us. I am 20 years older than the next oldest person. The physical standards to get there are very challenging. We had to go through 47 different competencies. At the South Pole, you're 3,800 miles from a hospital. So under the very best of circumstances, it would be a 4-day operation to get you to a hospital. So just to minimize the chances of something that's already inside of you coming out and then necessitating you getting to a hospital, they try to avoid that as much as possible. They wanted us to gain weight while we were there. They wanted me to gain about 15 pounds before I went. I ended up losing about 15 pounds while I was there. And I'll explain why. Part of it is because the food was frozen. And getting solid frozen food to become soft enough to eat is a challenge. The young woman here, her name's Elena. She is from Finland. The reason that she was there, she's getting a PhD in atmospheric science, but she's from Finland, and she spoke some Russian. One of the reasons I was chosen, I think there are 2 reasons I was chosen. Well, 3. I'm dumb enough to actually do this. But 2 of the other ones, I was an Army Ranger, so I do have some experience with being uncomfortable and being cold. I did go to the Army's Arctic Training Center in Black Rock, Alaska, a long time ago in the 80s. But I also speak some German. And so between she and I, we went to, and you might have heard of this, there's a Russian station called Vostok Station. Last year in July, the coldest ever recorded temperature on Earth was recorded near Vostok Station. Their equipment was telling us it was a negative 128. Our satellites were saying it was 144 below. And so, something's wrong. If we get that much of a difference from 2 different measuring devices, so we went to install some of our own equipment just for redundancy. Not sure the Russian equipment is terribly reliable. And so between she and I, we could talk with the Russians. There was no animosity. There's a great atmosphere of cooperation. That wasn't the issue. But the Russians just don't speak English. They do speak some German. So this team is out of the University of Wisconsin. So Antarctica is that 7th continent. It's the one that, when you were in 6th grade, you couldn't remember. But it is the highest, driest, coldest, and windiest continent on Earth. And it's much larger than most people think, because when you look at a map, it's just that little line at the bottom of the map, right, that you can't really get a good gauge of how big it is. But it's about 1.5 times the size of the United States. This peninsula right here goes up to Pittsburgh, roughly. So that's South America. Interestingly, nobody owns Antarctica. And there was an international treaty signed in 1956 that agreed, all the signatories agreed that no one can own Antarctica. But there are several countries that do have claims on Antarctica. We are not one of them. The country that actually has the best claim on Antarctica is Argentina. They claim that geographically they should own it because they think that it's just a continuation of that mountain range. If you look at the requirements to have a colony, one of the requirements is to have babies there. So Argentina brought down about 30 pregnant women. The women had their babies, and then they claim that then they have citizens of Antarctica. Not to be outdone, Chile brought down dead people and buried them because having a cemetery is also a requirement for having a colony. So there you go. What my job was to install automatic weather stations and maintain automatic weather stations that are already there. I'm not sure if you remember a couple of years ago, there was one of our astronauts, and I'm not sure which one, if it was John Glenn or somebody, one of the guys was there, and he was in his 80s, really had no business being there, was at the South Pole, had a problem, and they needed to get him off the continent, 3,800 miles from a hospital. At 60 below, jet fuel turns to jello. So airplanes don't fly very well. So they had to fly an airplane in under conditions that really airplanes should not have been flying, get him on the plane, and then get him to safety, risking a lot of people's lives. And the problem really is that we just don't know what the weather is to do something like that. And of course, weather in Antarctica affects our weather, and then there's all sort of climatic issues. But in the continental United States, we have 56,000 weather stations. On Antarctica, we have 132. Sometimes, generally, unless we're right here near McMurdo Station, and I'll explain all of this, but this is where McMurdo Station, New Zealand, is right here. But that is where our main base is. So we have a bunch of them clustered right there because most of our air traffic comes in and out of there. But from South Pole, which is right here, to Vostok Station is right here, that's about 1,000 miles. And we don't have any weather stations between there. So that's like between here and St. Louis. And if you fly an airplane between here and there, you would want to know what the weather is. Problem is, we have no idea what the weather is between those two spots. And so it's kind of dangerous, and we do want to know what that weather is. Okay. So, we did fly. I flew, obviously, from Pittsburgh. I teach at Shaler. I live in Economy Borough. And we flew to Houston, 15-hour flight to Auckland, New Zealand, crossed the international date line. Kids are fascinated. When you cross the international date line, one day just didn't exist. Went from the 23rd to the 25th. 24th didn't happen. You'd think the international date line's a straight line, but it's not. I actually crossed the international date line 5 times on the way there. Then from Auckland, we went to Christchurch, New Zealand. There's the international date line, by the way. And then at Christchurch, New Zealand, we were there for 3 days. While there, that is where the United States Antarctic program is. And we were issued all of our cold weather gear. You can't go to Dick's Sporting Goods and get a coat that will protect you. And so we were issued all of this really, really good gear. I didn't get to keep any of it, sadly. But depending on what your job is and where you're going to be, you get issued different gear. But anytime we fly in any aircraft, we have to be fully clothed in all of the gear, even if the aircraft is heated, because if the plane were to go down, you wouldn't have time to find your gear before you froze to death. So it was very uncomfortable sometimes if it was 0 in the airplane and 50 below outside. That's just a huge difference, and the clothing is definitely made for 50 below and not made for 0. So we flew from Christchurch after 3 days of quarantine. So we were quarantined for 2 reasons. One is physically, to make sure you don't have some common cold or something, because as an American, you can stay in Antarctica for 14 months in a row, but you're not allowed to stay for more than 14 months. But over 14 months, you lose an immunity to all the common stuff that we are exposed to all the time. So they want to make sure that we don't bring something down that's going to decimate the population of people who've been there a long time. The other one is psychologically. So we had to go through a whole bunch of psychological tests because when you're out on the ice, there is some sensory deprivation problems. The biggest problem is there's no smells. It's just ice. And here, when you smell, like if you smell anything, well, you might say no, but I smell all sorts of aftershave, deodorant, shampoo, coffee, all sorts of things. And your brain is used to processing all of that information. But when you're out in the middle of the ice and there's nothing to process, sometimes people's brains don't like that. And so some of the training we had to go through was sensory deprivation tanks to see if you have a problem with lack of sensory input. So we flew from Christchurch down to McMurdo Station on a C-17. There is no real military operation there. So these are, These are the three, come back a little bit, right there, stop. Oh, shoot. Sorry, guys. Okay, these are the three American bases and then all the other bases on the continent. McMurdo is down here. This is by far the biggest American station. There are about 800 people there in the summer, which was when I was there. And then in the winter, there are about 120 people there now. And it is inaccessible by boat or aircraft now. So those people are there by themselves without help for the next 6 months. South Pole Station in the summer had about 100 people, and there are probably about 40 people there, also inaccessible, but it is inaccessible for about 9 months a year. Way up here on the peninsula, way up there, that is Palmer Station. It is outside the Antarctic Circle, and it is accessible year-round by ship. All the other stations, you can see what countries own them. The Russians have the most stations, but most of them are abandoned. So they had stations, but they don't have them. Interestingly, the Germans during World War II flew over and threw harpoons out of airplanes to later be able to come back and find them and prove that they had been there. The Russians, there are several statues of Stalin just randomly placed out in the middle of Antarctica so that they could come back. They do have radiation signatures so that they can be found easily in case they ever needed to claim that they should own Antarctica. So that was a 5-hour flight on a C-17. The C-17 did not have skis. So people wonder what the consistency of the snow and ice is. It's solid enough to land a C-17 with wheels. So this is inside the C-17, just full of gear. Everything that comes down obviously has to come by plane. This is sea ice. So we're on about 30 feet of frozen sea ice. Everything you see in the distance is an island. These islands are where Roald Amundsen and Robert Falcon Scott both left on their quest to get to the South Pole. This is just at McMurdo Station, so this is just common sites that you would see at McMurdo. When we would go out to remote stations, we would have all our gear sling loaded under a helicopter. They'd take us out for 3 days and then leave us there and then come back 3 days later and pick us up. So this was absolutely common, something you don't see here, but something you would see every couple of minutes in Antarctica. 24 hours of daylight, so there's no day or night. Your body doesn't know when to go to sleep. You get physically tired, but your brain doesn't tell you that it's nighttime. But the helicopter's life goes 24 hours a day because there's only about a 2-month window we can get all of this science done. There is some internet access, but only when the satellites are visible, and it takes 8 minutes for a satellite to come above this horizon, traverse the sky, and disappear below that horizon. So every scientist on the continent is waiting, and we have schedules, so we know exactly when that satellite comes up. The instant it does, everyone's on their computer trying to get their information up and bring their information down and send a text to their wives. So these are just normal things. So the biggest risk we had was not freezing to death, but it was actually crevasses. A crevasse is a crack in the ice. These glaciers are 1,000, 1,500 miles long, and they don't move at the same rate necessarily all the time. And so these glaciers develop cracks. when they do, it can be like an earthquake. It can be sudden and violent, and I did not experience this, but they say you can hear it coming, maybe like an earthquake. Or it can be just very subtle and slow. The wind is at an average of about 75 miles an hour, almost constantly, can get above 200 miles an hour. That kind of wind will just drift over these cracks, and then you can't see them. So our biggest threat was falling in a crevasse. So anytime that we were not in a very known and stable place, we were tethered together with ropes. We'd carry ice axes, crampons, and that sort of stuff, so that if one of our party were to fall in the crack, the rest of us would fall. There's a method to this, and put your ice axes in the ground and try to, arrest the fall, and then there's a system to repel or pull people back up out of there. So I'll get back to this later. By the way, if you have any questions, please ask, because I have about 3 hours of stuff to tell you, and I only have about 40 minutes to do it. So if you have questions, by all means, ask. Yes, sir.
What's the estimate of bodies that are in?
There are a lot. 2 years ago, a teacher like me was there, actually looking for crevasses. They use ground-penetrating radar to find them, and fell in and is still there. 600-foot drop, and it's just, if you don't survive, it's not worth the risk of other people's lives. As hard and cold as that sounds, he's there for another 5,000 years until he breaks off on a glacier or into an iceberg and melts and becomes fish food. Robert Falcon Scott, by the way, who is one of the Antarctic explorers, is frozen in a glacier. He never made it back from his trek, so he's in about 80,000 years he'll break off in a glacier or in an iceberg. So there are some Weddell seals near that Ross Island McMurdo station. So these are, by the way, doors in and out of the buildings. They're freezer doors, if you've ever had an opportunity to see big open freezer doors. I thought that the reason that we use freezer doors was because it's cold on the outside and warm on the inside. And by warm, it's about 40 degrees inside the buildings. Just because the amount of energy it takes to keep it really warm is not worth the expense. So it is above freezing, but just. But the doors, the reason we have these doors is not because of the cold differential, it's because of air pressure. We have, in South Pole, or the Antarctica, wind is different from here. If there are any meteorologists among you, or if you know anything about this, most wind here is generated by pressure systems, high pressure and low pressure. And that's true there, but not as much. A lot of the wind there is generated, it's called Katabatic Wind. Cold air is heavy. The continent is sort of dome-shaped, so South Pole is at 9,300 feet of elevation. McMurdo Station is at sea level, so that cold air just slides off the continent, and it'll come in channels. And you can have wind that's 200 miles an hour by the back doors, and no wind at all where I'm standing. So you can have these currents of wind. So these doors are here, and they're specially designed because when the Navy was there in 1956, they hadn't quite figured this out, and the wind would blow the doors in. Not blow the doors open, they would blow the doors in, the door frame and everything. So that's why we have these doors. That's just another freezer door. So there is glacial ice coming off the continent, and then there's frozen sea ice. Where those two bump together, the sea ice gets pressed up, and it causes cracks. And then if you see that black blob in the distance, that's a seal. That's a Weddell seal. They're about 9 feet long and weigh about 1,000 pounds. And if you were here and you were this distance away, you would be able to smell that seal. They stink like fish. This is just this mode of transportation. There are several wheeled vehicles there at McMurdo Station, but most vehicles are tracked. So this is a little misleading. I'm in shirt sleeves, but it's about 20 below. It's not windy. We were working on some of this weather equipment in the background, and part of our job was to dig up batteries. So there are solar panels, and they charge batteries, and then the batteries run the systems all through the Antarctic winter where it's dark for 6 months. But you don't want to get sweaty. because at 20 below, sweat can kill you if you get too sweaty. And so it's a desert, and relative humidity at 20 below is very, very low as opposed to relative humidity today here where it's 95% humidity. So 5% humidity at 20 below, there's very, very little air, water in the air. So if you take your coat off, you'll dry almost instantly. So kids get very confused when they see me and I say it's 20 below and I'm wearing a t-shirt. By the way, that mountain in the background right here, this is, that is Mount Erebus. It's an active volcano. There are 7 active volcanoes in Antarctica. This is one of only 2 on Earth that has an open magma pool. So if you were to look into the cone, you'd see bubbling and boiling magma. The other one is Kilauea, I think. There are 7. 4 of them are under the ice, and they think that there have been at least 2 eruptions within the last year completely under the ice with no visible effect on the surface. Although we do see the surface, the top, coming down. And I'm sure you've noticed, but there's been a lot of plate tectonic activity and a lot of volcanic activity in the last 5 or 6 years. Sorry. Kids are very interested in this kind of thing. So this is glacial ice. So it's about 600 feet thick. Where the seals are, that ice is about 8 or 10 feet thick. So I'll show you that in just a second. So he asked if we hear about the Arctic ice melting, and he asked if the South Pole ice is melting. And the answer is no, actually. Lately, the last several years, the cover of Antarctic ice has been increasing. You hear some different stuff. This is outside of my realm of expertise. I'm a school teacher. But the Antarctic ice is, for whatever reason, increasing. There are areas that seem to have less ice, and there are areas that seem to have more ice. There is more precipitation in the last 2 years than there has been on record. So I can't comment on global warming or man-made global warming or what the effects are. I do know, however, that the sea ice in the area had not retreated for 3 years, and it had done that every year for the last 150. So it yeah. So he mentioned the magnetic pole. So and I'm sure you all know this. The actual pole, South Pole and North Pole, are not the magnetic poles of Earth, and they do migrate. They seem to be getting closer. And at some point here, it is expected that that polarity will just flip, and that your compass that you've had forever when you were a Boy Scout, when you were 12, won't work anymore, and that you'll just have to get a new compass. There will be no change in life. You wouldn't know it. You would have to read about it in the paper in the morning. But the magnetic South Pole is about 1,800 miles north of the geographic South Pole. So at South Pole Station is some of the best research on that, and again, this is outside my realm of expertise, but I was told that that has improved significantly. All right, so this is the pressure ridges where we're walking on 6-foot thick ice that is being compressed by 600-foot thick ice. So these seals find cracks and come up on the surface and just lay there. The ice is beautiful, and it's pushed up into 30 or 40 foot tall chunks. It's amazing. Right there it's sunny, but I was out there at a different time when it wasn't sunny, and but it was sunny several miles away. The ice will sort of act like fiber optics, and even though it's not sunny where you are, the ice will glow blue. And it's amazing. So you might see some glow bluing, and that is from sunlight that is far away. Yes, sir? Yeah, the salinity of the water underneath frozen sea ice is significantly more salty than just general ocean water, because as that sea ice freezes, it compresses the salt out. So those flags indicate either crevasses or safe areas to walk through. The seals are not at all concerned about us. Instinctually, they must think that we're penguins. So you can walk right up to them, they'll look at you, and they just roll over and go back to sleep. They're not concerned at all about us. They eat only fish and seaweed. Well, there are cracks in the ocean where they came up from, and they just go back down, and they come back up to those same cracks because they're about 80 miles from open water. So they have to come back to those same cracks. By the way, we're not allowed to have dogs on the continent. They used to use sled dogs, but the dogs have distemper, and the distemper was getting into the seals. That's the only penguin I saw, by the way. My friends took these pictures when they went to other places, but I didn't see these. I saw that one single penguin. I was at the New Zealand base. Everyone else had better cameras than me, and they said there's a penguin out there, and everyone is taking a picture in that direction. So I just took a picture in that direction and then later zoomed in on the picture. That one penguin, though, was probably a goner because it had probably come up through one of those cracks just like the seals did, but he was so far from open water that he was a single solitary penguin is a goner probably. So this is at McMurdo Station. This is what the weather looked like most of the time, probably a 40, 50 mile an hour wind. It is not actually snowing, this is blowing snow. So we were told, that's a laboratory there, we were told that there was a storm coming, this Katabatic Wind, and they call it a ground blizzard, that we needed to go back to where our dormitory was to get a bigger coat. So this is called Little Red, this coat, and then there's another coat called Big Red. But if we didn't have that coat, we would end up having to stay for several days in that building. So I was on my way back to get the big coat. This was the day before, beautiful, perfect weather, 20 below and sunny, no wind. And then within a few hours, this kind of weather. And again, it's not actually snowing, this is just blowing snow. There are ropes between the buildings so that if you get outside and get disoriented, if you get near a building, there's a rope, and then you go either direction, it'll take you to some shelter. So this was just common, what it looked like most of the time. So a lot of time is wasted just because of weather problems. This was our mode of transportation almost always. Within 5 or 10 miles, we would take snowmobiles. These things are called Haglins. But most of the time, we'd fly in airplanes. There you go, there's a tracked truck. That's an automatic weather station. And that's what we were working on and looking for. So we would fly in helicopters most of the time, so we could go within about 200 miles. There's Mount Erebus. These automatic weather stations are on glaciers, and the glaciers are moving. So one of the jobs I had, having been a ranger in the Army, part of my job was a forward observer, so trying to tell the artillery how to hit a target using triangulation. So part of my job here was trying to predict where the automatic weather station was going to be, accounting for glacial drift. So we would fly out, they would unload all of our gear, and then they would fly away and leave us there. It's a strange feeling. This is not one of those instances. We're only about 100 miles from the next human in this picture. There's other times when we were 500 miles from the next living thing in any direction. So they left us. We did find the automatic weather station. But it's absolutely silent. Yes, sir, sorry. It's about 12,000 feet. So so that mountain in the background is Mount Terror. Most of these were named by Robert Falcon Scott's crew as they were going to the South Pole. The Norwegians took dog sleds to get to the South Pole. There was a race between the two of them. The Norwegians got there first, of course, because they were using dog sleds. The British walked. They dragged sleds 1,800 miles from McMurdo Station down to South Pole Station. And of course, misery the entire way. 3 of them died on the way back. They did make it to the pole, but only to see Edmondson's tent and a flag and a note that said, we got there first. But as the British were coming and going, they were naming geographical features, and everything the British named were terror, horror, dismal, like, Frozen Toes Point, like just what was in their mind as they were doing it. But the Norwegians, theirs was like Victory Mountain, and everything was great for them. So 1904, I think. I'm sorry, sir, I don't know exactly. Barely. I could show you some pictures if we have time of the British crew. Their faces are black, frozen, frostbite. Yes, sir. So here, obviously, we use freezers or coolers to keep your food cool. We would use coolers to keep your food warm. Most of the food we ate was freeze-dried. Are you good, sir?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Was freeze-dried because if it has any liquid in it, it would become frozen solid and takes too much energy to thaw it. So anything dry, we did carry water on ourselves, but even getting water to melt, 80 below zero ice to melt, to be liquid, takes an awful lot of energy. Yes, sir. So I'm a pretty active guy. I generally eat about 3,000 calories a day here. We were expected to consume about right around 6,000 calories. They push a lot of chocolate, very high-fat diet, and I lost 15 pounds when I was there. South Pole is at elevation. It's at about 9,300 feet, so half as much oxygen. Your heart beats twice as fast. You have to breathe twice as quickly, so your caloric needs are much higher there. Yes, sir? So we do have little stove heaters, but not for use inside of tents. So at elevation, water boils at a lower temperature. So yes, we would use that, but not general wholesale fire just to keep warm. Yes, sir. I think, and again, this is outside of my area of expertise, and I'm probably more. So do you remember looking at the map of the continent and then the United States overlaid over it? Delaware is a tiny little spot. In my opinion, these things break off all the time and float off, and that's just what happens. Glaciers float down the continent and break off into icebergs and float away. I don't think it's a terribly unusual occurrence. No, sir. Yes, sir. I'll get to that, but yeah, keeping water liquid is a problem. Our coats have big pockets inside to keep water bottles. Another thing I hope to get to, and I apologize because I can tell already we are not going to get to lots of great stuff. I apologize because I have no idea what time it is, but we're probably pushing on time here. So 20 minutes, okay. So another interesting thing is this continent is absolutely perfectly clean, right? No humans have ever been there. Only 4,000 people go there a year. When you're 500 miles from the next human, and I apologize for this, but you are not allowed to pee on the ice. You can't leave anything out there. Everything that comes in comes out. So inside my coat, there are 2 pockets, one for fresh water and one for pee. Every bit of pee is boiled. The water is reclaimed because that would be a waste of energy. The yellow paste that's left over is shipped back to San Francisco. I don't know what they do with it there, right? Yeah. 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 And so, since we're on the topic, when it's 60 below zero with an 80-mile-an-hour wind, going to the bathroom is a challenge. Just peeing in the wind is a challenge anytime, but trying to collect it is also a challenge. Any exposed skin at that temperature is absolutely dangerous. So going to the bathroom is something you need to think about a half hour before you do it, and it takes a good bit of preparation. We would almost immediately set up tents. If it's 60 below zero, the tent will, in daylight, in a bright daylight, will get about a 40-degree temperature gain inside the tent. So it's a nice warm -10 inside the tent. You can have exposed skin for a minute at -10. So going to the bathroom, pee is easy enough to deal with. The other, going to the bathroom, is more of a challenge. And so this is a bit of a joke, and kids will ask, well, what do you do about that? And the answer is, depends. They don't get that joke. Yeah, so when a fourth grader looks at me and says, Mr. Penn wore a diaper, yes, I did. So there you go. Yeah, so that's an automatic weather station. It has a satellite link to the Argos satellite constellation. These helicopters would fly right up 10 feet from us, land right in front of us. Then if we go a little further, we take these planes called Twin Otters. This one is actually owned by New Zealand. It does have skis. I actually got to go where no human has ever been, which still gives me goosebumps. So we had to fly out 500 miles, but the plane, they won't fly more than 250 miles because they don't want to be low on fuel. So out in the middle of this vast ice sheet, there's a fuel cache. Just these two big tanks of fuel just sitting out in the middle of nowhere. We landed the airplane, stuck a hose in the tank and a pump and filled up the plane and flew away. It was pretty interesting. You'll be able to tell how cold it is by whether my mustache is frozen. So at about 40 below, when you exhale, the humidity in your breath freezes on your mustache. Those are the fuel caches there. At one point, when it was about 60 below, my mustache was totally frozen, and without thinking, I wiped my nose, and I broke my mustache off, like wiped it off. I looked like an Amish farmer for about a week. Sorry, I'm... So, sorry. At about 30 or 40 below, then you need to really start wearing a mask. Later in the videos here, you'll see, and generally I was wearing a mask, but at 20 below, it's not such a big deal. It's just like, what it was like this winter. But in every direction, there's just nothing, no sounds, no smells, silent, just amazing. Yes. So we flew then from McMurdo Station to South Pole on a C-130. These do have skis. They have skis not because of the consistency of the ice at South Pole, but in case they would need to put the plane down somewhere between those two spots where they weren't quite sure of the condition of the snow, if there were crevasses, if they had to land in an area that was likely to have crevasses. If you haven't been in a C-130, not very comfortable. I jumped out of these 168 times as an Army paratrooper. That was my seat right there. But that was a 5-hour unpleasant flight to South Pole. You probably know as you go up in altitude every 1,000 feet, you lose 4 degrees. So it was about 100 below in the air temperature was about 100 below. So this is South Pole. It looks pretty much like everywhere else, although there are no mountains sticking up. The snow is 9,300 feet deep. But it is the southernmost point on Earth, right? It's 9,000 feet thick of ice. At that altitude, the physio altitude, and because it's so cold, it's about 10,000 feet of equivalent air pressure. So again, your heart beats twice as fast. needed to be in relatively good shape. At McMurdo, there were several other people of roughly my age, but when I got to South Pole, I was by far the oldest person. I was conspicuously old at South Pole. There are maybe 20% women, and probably not because they aren't capable, because a lot of the science is, of course, done by women, but more just because of having a beard and the likelihood of getting frostbite. Certainly a benefit to have a beard. If you don't have a beard, and even though if you wear a scarf or a mask, as you all know, when you were 7 years old and wore your scarf, you'd get it just soaking wet because of your breath, right? And then that would freeze solid, and then that would freeze to your face. Yes, I got a couple of questions. Way in the back, sir. So mine are prescription sunglasses. Contacts are a problem. And then you need to have the reflection. We needed to wear sunscreen under your nose and under your chin because you get about 87% reflection of the rays off the sun coming back up at you. Yes, sir. Yeah, so this is the southernmost point on Earth. If you stand on that exact point, every direction is north, right? Because every direction is up. Magnetically, the pole is 1,800 miles north of the South Pole. So they use a circumpolar navigation system where you put a grid over the pole so that the 0 point is on the prime meridian. The 180-degree line is on the international date line. So everything is either grid east or grid west. So you would be grid east at 1 degree or grid west at 270 degrees at whatever azimuth, at whatever distance. So we walked through 12 time zones from the plane to the station, about 100 yards. This is the station. It's on stilts. It can be jacked up so it doesn't get buried in the snow. There are buildings that I'll show you in a minute that are actually buried. They're Navy Quonset huts that have been there since the 50s. So those time zones, right, converge on that single point. There is a pole in the ground. This is not it. This is where the pole was when that building was built. The pole has drifted about 100 yards to the grid east. Well, actually, yeah, the building has drifted to the east. The pole has stayed in the same spot. And at that point, all time zones come together at that single point. So if you just walk in a circle, you've walked through every time zone. If you stand on that line and I step here into the eastern hemisphere, it's tomorrow. If I step over here, it's yesterday. So I can step from yesterday back into tomorrow just like that. That is the pole. If you see that little thing right there sticking up, they move it every year. They figure out where it is, but that is the actual geographic South Pole. It's about 40, 50 below here, probably a 30-mile-an-hour wind. It's not an accident. There you go. It's at least 40 below because my mustache is frozen. But it's not a mistake that the United States has a base right on the pole. If we ever needed to say we own the place, we have by far the biggest presence there. These bulldozers run constantly just to keep the building above the surface. And again, it doesn't snow much, but there's a lot of blowing snow. So there you can see the very, very windy. And those are piles of snow that have been pushed out from underneath the building. Absolutely. Yes. So some of those are wind chills, by the way. Yeah, NASA there's a lot of astronomy being done there. And there's a neutrino detector under the ice. If you know anything about particle physics, neutrinos fly across the universe. They can fly through the Earth and not hit anything. They're so small and so energetic, they can just fly through the molecules and not hit anything. So these are wind chills. So at the pole there, it's roughly 100 below zero. No questions? I saw a hand back there at some point. So this is inside the station. It's kept at about 40 degrees. What you're going to see here, this is just outside the station, but what I really wanted to show is a condition called flat white. And again, it has to do with this psychological thing where our brains don't like it when you can't tell the difference between the sky and the ground. Everything looks exactly the same. So people get disoriented and fall down. Some people feel claustrophobic because there's no sense of space. So obviously you can't fly in this if the pilot can't tell the difference between the sky and the ground. And as long as you have a reference, if you see another person and they're upright, then your ears and your brain, your ears and your eyes agree and you're fine. But if you don't have a reference and you can't see anything, people will fall down just because their ears say they're vertical, but their eyes don't give them any information. Yes, sir. It's all heated with jet fuel. Everything either runs on jet fuel and heats jet fuel. So there's only about 2 months of actual sun there, and it's only at the best at a 23-degree angle. So solar panels aren't effective at that angle, unfortunately. They've tried to use wind turbines, but the wind is so strong, consistently strong, they shred them. Yeah. So unfortunately, jet fuel is the best option. So this plane took us out and sat next to us for several days and ran almost constantly. They'd shut it down, but then they would wrap the engines in blanket, a special kind of blanket sort of thing. You can see how deeply we had to dig down to get to these battery boxes, dig 7 feet down. The consistency of the snow is very thick. It's very much like digging in dirt here. It just weighs a lot less. This is the day, by the way, that I wiped my mustache off. These are our tents, by the way. So they're called Arctic ovens. We were on big foam slabs just to keep us up off the ground because you would freeze to the ground. We would expect to stay for 3 days, but we would bring supplies for 3 weeks. You see the canisters of oxygen and acetylene and that kind of stuff back there, and a whole bunch of gear. We did get stuck for several days. Here, when it gets to be about 60 or 70 mile an hour wind, even if you're in the tent, it'll blow you and your tent away. So at some point, we realized that things were getting bad. We fueled the aircraft and had it leave because we didn't have time and we needed to stay. So the plane left, and we dug down into the ground and stayed underground for a couple of days. I think I have some pictures of that. And then we also carried a bag that could artificially create pressure. So if you're already at 10,000 feet of altitude, it's already very low pressure, but when a low pressure system comes, there you go, you can see we're trying to fuel the aircraft and get it out of there because we were afraid the airplane would blow away or blow over. So these are just some pictures of the blizzard. That's where the beginnings of where we stayed. Maybe you're already crazy, and maybe it's a pretty short. It's a pretty short trip. So this is a gamma bag. So at 10,000 feet, already at very high pressure, then a low pressure system comes. That young woman that we were with, the smaller you are, the more likely you are to be affected by these pressure changes. It's a rapid pressure change, and you get altitude sickness or mountain sickness. So we were prepared to do this and put her in the bag. You pump up pressure so the body feels like you're at a more comfortable altitude. We ended up not having to do it. The weather did improve, but we were working on doing that. By the way, we were all qualified as EMTs, emergency medical technicians. We were all qualified to give blood transfusions. We were all A positive blood. In case somebody were to lose a lot of blood and need blood, we were the walking blood banks. In terms of temperature?
Well, yeah.
So North Pole is water surrounded by land, but South Pole is a continent, so it's significantly colder at the South Pole. Did that answer the question? Okay. Are we okay on time, guys? Because honestly, I'll talk all day here. Okay. So I'm going to move forward just to something else that I think you might be interested in. There, Robert Falcon Scott set up a hut on one of his trips, and it's still there. It was used by several operations. There it is. Sorry. It was used by several, right there, stop. Yeah, we're almost done. Sorry. That's Christmas Day, by the way. And this hut was used by several different expeditions, but it's still there. The last time it was used by 6 men who were stranded here. They were stranded here through an Antarctic winter. When the weather broke, 3 of the 6 men decided that they were going to walk the 40 miles to another hut that was on another island, not only 40 miles away. They took off on their own and were never seen again. The other 3 stayed and were rescued about a month later. When they were rescued, they just left the building. Everything, left it all, because they saw a sail in the distance. So they went out to the sail and were just left. So this is the hut, and I apologize, I will make this quick. But outside the door, there is a seal that they had killed that day, still laying there. They kept warm with seal blubber, so right inside the door, there's a stack of seal blubber about this thick that still has the vertebrae. If you can see it, there are ribs and vertebrae there. And there's still sugar and oatmeal and dog biscuits and everything they were using, right down to the skillet that had seal meat in it, is still sitting there. It's amazing. It's just too cold. There are no bugs. There's no bacteria. There's nothing to break it down. I'm sorry, gentlemen. I have so much more to tell you, but I'm out of time. So I appreciate it.